By the end of the summer of 1950, North Korea had the United Nations forces surrounded at the Pusan Perimeter in a last-ditch defense of the Korean Peninsula. While all seemed lost, a series of surprise moves would push the North Koreans well back into their own territory by the beginning of November 1950. So how did UN forces break out of the Pusan Perimeter? What happened at the Inchon landings? And how did UN forces push the North Koreans back to the Yalu River and almost into China? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. And in this episode, we're discussing the Army's role in the Korean War from the Pusan breakout through the retreat of North Korean forces to the Yalu River in November 1950. And joining me for this discussion is Army historian Dr. Peter Knight. So welcome back, Pete.
Thanks, Lee. It's my pleasure to be here once again.
Yeah, we had a fascinating discussion in the previous podcast, the first part of the Korean War, and I'm really looking forward to the U.S. and UN forces taking the offensive here. But before we get into that, just a little background on Dr. Knight. So Dr. Peter Knight is the director of the Historical Studies Directorate at the U.S. Army Center of Military History. Dr. Knight joined CMH after retiring from the U.S. Army as a lieutenant colonel after 23 years of service in the military intelligence branch. In his 23 years of service, he served in numerous tactical and strategic level intelligence assignments. Dr. Knight is a 1994 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, and he later earned his Ph.D. in history from the Ohio State University in June of 2006. His area of historical specialization is strategic intelligence in the Korean War. He wrote his doctoral thesis on this subject and published a chapter on intelligence in the Ashgate Research Companion to the Korean War, which was published in 2014. Dr. Knight is also the author of the revised CMH publication, The Staff Ride, Fundamentals, Experiences, and Techniques, published in 2020. He has led numerous battlefield staff rides for the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, and congressional delegations across the globe. So, Dr. Knight, again, take your experience. I know you served in Korea, and this was a focus of a lot of your work, intelligence in Korea. So, your insights here on Korea are fantastic. So let's pick up this discussion by just kind of briefly summarizing how we got here. You know, by the end of the summer of 1950, North Korean the invasion of South Korea has gone extremely well for the North Koreans. They had the United Nations forces now with their backs to the sea in the Pusan Perimeter. So just briefly explain where the war stands at this point in early 1950.
Yes. So 8th Army Commander Lieutenant General Walton Walker is seemingly facing an impossible task around this time. But thanks to United Nations air and naval superiority and the help of American communications intelligence, Walker is able to interdict the elongating logistical lines of the North Korean Army and begin to vector UN forces throughout the Pusan Perimeter to various hotspots on the perimeter where the comment tip-offs indicate imminent North Korean attacks. The comment also provided valuable feedback on the effects of United Nations airstrikes on the North Korean forces, enabling advanced or ongoing knowledge of any ammunition, food, or fuel shortages the North Koreans were experiencing, and thus pointing out areas where they might be vulnerable to eventual counterattack. With the perimeter stabilizing with the arrival of additional UN forces, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur's staff was already hard at work planning an amphibious end run to get behind the North Korean Army and cut it off from its lengthening logistical and communication lines. From the first days of the North Korean attack, General MacArthur perceived that the deeper the North Korean forces pushed into South Korea, the more vulnerable that army would become to an amphibious envelopment.
Yeah, I mean, they have stretched lines of communication and support from the north, so I could see how that played a role. But you mentioned something in the previous podcast I just want to jump on now, is that, and this is the first time that I've heard this, that the invasion of Inchon, going behind the enemy forces, was something that MacArthur had really conceived from the beginning. It wasn't just like, oh, here we are now with our backs to the sea in Pusan. Oh, let me see if I can go around here.
Yes. So, conceptually, this is all unfolding in MacArthur's mind as he's seeing what the North Koreans are doing, what their intentions are in trying to push the UN forces into the sea and overrun the peninsula and occupy it. He sees that vulnerability immediately with all of the coastline that Korea has. And MacArthur naturally gravitates to that, right, based on his World War II experiences. Ever since Bataan, every operational campaign he waged in World War II had an amphibious beginning to it.
Wow. And
so he was well versed in the potential and what could be achieved through those operations with the combination of ground, air, and naval power. Yeah. And so he immediately gravitates to that course of action, seeing and particularly Inchon because of its close proximity to Seoul.
Right.
Seoul is where the road networks and the rail lines converge on the peninsula at the narrow waist of the peninsula. And so he knows that's the North Korean lifeline.
Yeah.
And if he can land at Inchon and move that short distance, 25 miles in, to take Seoul, he can sever that line of communications and force the North Korean People's Army to have to fall back to defend that, or otherwise, and it will take the foot off the gas, if you will, of their ability to overrun the peninsula.
So talk about this offensive. Now, it didn't start, this whole offensive, it didn't start with Inchon. It started at Pusan, didn't it?
Well, yeah,
the breakout, or
no, the breakout will actually follow the landing at Inchon within a day. But the key is they needed to stabilize the perimeter, and also there's a certain amount of the fact that the North Koreans are laser focused on that perimeter and trying to overrun it makes them that much more vulnerable, right? To not paying attention to what's going to happen in their rear area.
But how do you get an invasion force? I know the North Koreans didn't have any real air assets, but nobody was watching. I mean, we talked in the last podcast about some intelligence failures at the beginning of the war on the American side, but this is a huge intelligence failure for
the North Koreans.
Yeah,
certainly. Well, and that's not to say that no one was watching. And allow me to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to set the background here, and then I'll talk about the intelligence warnings for the North Koreans. But MacArthur's plan largely entails a hammer and anvil concept. The anvil consisted of the amphibious assault behind the North Korean lines, the best location being Inchon, the port city on the Yellow Sea halfway up Korea's western coast. The rock capital Seoul was a short 25 miles inland from Inchon, and it was in Seoul that the main roads and the rail lines converged. MacArthur reasoned that a forced landing at Inchon would have to move inland only a short distance to sever the North Korean supply lines. A secondary consideration was Seoul's psychological importance as the traditional capital for all of Korea. And MacArthur believed a landing at Inchon and taking Seoul set up an anvil that awaited the 8th Army hammer in the form of a breakout from the Pusan Perimeter and an advance towards Seoul to either cut off and crush the North Korean forces between the two UN elements, or force the North Korean army to make a slow and difficult withdrawal through the mountains farther to the east. To execute this offensive would require an amphibious landing force separate from the 8th Army. To do this, MacArthur stands up the X Corps, the 10th Corps, that will be led by his United Nations Command, Far East Command Chief of Staff, Major General Edward Ned Almond. The 10th Corps would be comprised of the 7th Infantry Division under Major General David Barr and the 1st Marine Division, augmented with the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, all under the command of Marine Brigadier General O.P. Smith, as well as 8,600 Katusas, these are Korean augmentees to the U.S. Army, and a ROK Marine Corps regiment and supporting artillery, engineer, and other support assets. But operational security for what was known as Operation Chromite was not good.
Oh.
Planners knew from the beginning it would be next to impossible to hide the buildup of naval vessels and the loading of troops and equipment in Japanese ports, let alone conceal the departure of those ships from Chinese and North Korean agents in Japan. The operation had the dubious nickname Operation Common Knowledge.
Oh, wow.
But with the destination of the amphibious task force kept closely guarded, the enemy could only speculate on precisely when and where the landing would take place. Chinese officials warned Kim Il-sung that the West Coast ports, and especially Inchon, would be vulnerable targets. But Kim Il-sung was laser-focused on pushing the Eighth Army into the sea and ignored those warnings.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
So Operation Chromite commences on 15 September 1950 with the objective to capture the port of Inchon and liberate Seoul. The 10th Corps Invasion Force numbered nearly 70,000 men. It was the largest amphibious operation since the invasion of Okinawa in World War II.
Wow.
The initial phase called for the seizure of the fortified Wolmi-do Island that protected Inchon Harbor. And the assault force consisted of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, and a platoon of 9 M26 tanks from Company A, 1st Marine Tank Battalion. They hit Wolmi Island at 0633 and moved rapidly inland against little resistance. The reduction of Wolmi-do was completed by 0750. Marine casualties were 17 wounded, enemy losses were 108 killed and 136 captured. Pre-invasion intelligence about Wolmi Island proved accurate. Enemy prisoners indicated about 400 soldiers of North Korea's 3rd Battalion, 226 Independent Marine Regiment, and some artillery troops of their 918th Artillery Regiment were the ones defending the island. But where did they get this pre-invasion intelligence? Operation Chromite's success was the function of an incredible intelligence gathering effort orchestrated by Major General Willoughby and spearheaded by a U.S. naval officer, Lieutenant Eugene Franklin Clark, and his joint CIA military intelligence team that consisted largely of South Korean partisans, and they waged their own private guerrilla war in the islands outside of Inchon Harbor about a month prior to the landings. As a result of Clark's exploits and reporting to Tokyo, UN forces knew the layout and troop strength of the existing North Korean defenses at Inchon. They knew how high to make the scaling ladders to get over the harbor seawalls, and they knew where the sandbars were strongest to support amphibious landing craft to offload troops and equipment, and how best to time the landing with the prevailing tidal patterns of the harbor, which were some of the largest tidal fluctuations in the world at Inchon Harbor. 3rd Marine elements landed at Green, Red, and Blue Beach areas at Wolmi-do Island and at 2 other locations on the northern and southern parts of Inchon Harbor and advanced inland. And Inchon was taken by 0130 on 16 September. Marine casualties were 20 men killed, 174 wounded, 1 missing in action. The 10th Corps movement inland toward Seoul was further aided by communications intelligence, giving prior warning of North Korean armored columns leaving Seoul. The Marines were able to lay an ambush for those armored columns and defeat them. It was no cakewalk, though. Seoul wasn't finally captured until the 25th of September after brutal fighting on the high ground surrounding the city and then brutal house-to-house fighting within the city.
And is that north and south of the river that they captured?
That is both north and south of the river. As you know, Seoul... The Han River runs through Seoul, so there's the northern and southern portions. But yes, and UN casualties were 566 killed, 2,713 wounded, but the NKPA lost more than 35,000 killed, wounded, or captured.
Wow. That's a heavy loss. And at this point, 10 days in after that battle, where are they getting reinforcements from? The North Koreans.
So the North Koreans did have one division that they were moving south from from the Uijeongbu area down towards Seoul. So that does provide them some reinforcements. There were about 20,000 defending Seoul, and the heaviest of the fighting was in the last, that last 4 or 5 days between 20 and 25 September.
And then when it comes to weapons and equipment, I mean, it sounds like the U.S. forces are now fully capable. We've got our own tanks. We've got anti-tank weapons.
Yes.
And everything
You've got
is
tanks,
working the way
you've got
it's designed.
artillery, you've got air power. Everything is being brought to bear. Naval gunfire support. Yes,
Right.
it is. We're bringing everything we can.
So the mistakes of Task Force Smith, I know there was that motto afterwards, no more Task Force Smiths. But it seems like they took that to heart.
Absolutely.
So they're prepared with the right weapons.
And as much as the ROC Army had borne the brunt and paid a heavy price in the initial invasion, many of their units were being reconstituted as well.
And I just have to say, this makes me think back to, we were unprepared at the beginning of the war, just a couple months before this. How quickly American support, logistics, equipment was able to get there.
Yes, I mean they really started to kick it into high gear once we realized that yes, we were committing our forces to Korea, that we were going to draw the line in the sand, so to speak, and make a stand.
Yeah, it's often been said, and I know I've said this on previous podcasts. Is I forget who initially said this, but good generals know tactics, great generals know logistics. And I mean, this just jumps out at me right now. 2 months after we were so ill prepared, that we're now doing this. It's fascinating.
Yes, and I tell you, I give what is often overlooked, and something I certainly tried to bring out in my own doctoral research, was the level of intelligence preparation for this operation was absolutely incredible. And people didn't even know about Eugene Franklin Clark and his operations until they found his personal account in a safety deposit box many years after the war. And read about it, and then put the pieces together. And I put the pieces together with Willoughby's theater strategic reconnaissance plan, and looking at the coverage he had, and making sure that they were monitoring to make sure that the Chinese wouldn't intervene in any sort of landing attempt at Inchon as well. They were watching the straits, watching Formosa, watching all of those areas to ensure nothing would impede that operation. To include, the North Koreans were starting to put mines in Inchon Harbor. They were only beginning, though. They had just started, and Clark was reporting on the fact that he saw mines on some of the islands and so on. But they hadn't gotten to the point where they had seeded them. But if they had delayed their operation any longer, that would have been a big factor.
And this just goes to show you, to anybody that's listening, any student of military history or interested in serving in the military, the importance of combined arms. It's the logistics, it's the intelligence. It's not just the combat forces themselves. How critical all these elements are to the success of these missions, and this is just a great example of that. So good. Was there anything else on the capture of Seoul? Then I want to kind of shift over and talk about what's happening in Pusan.
Yeah, certainly we can do that. So further to the south, the 8th Army's battle line at its closest point was 180 air miles from the 10th Corps' landing area in the rear at Inchon. The winding mountain roads that lay ahead of the 8th Army made that distance even longer. As the 10th Corps secures Inchon on the 16th of September, Lieutenant General Walton Walker's 8th Army begins to push out of the Pusan perimeter. The breakout began at 0900 on the 16th of September. This offensive was not simultaneous, as many units were still repelling enemy attacks against the perimeter. As I said before, Kim Il-sung is laser focused on trying to push the 8th Army into the sea, and they're not letting up. The momentum of the breakout builds gradually in the face of strong enemy resistance, centered on several hills that controlled the 8th Army's main avenues of advance northward. Hill 268, for example, on the northwest side, was assaulted by the 5th Regimental Combat Team attached to the 1st Cavalry Division and captured, but that unit then had to consolidate and await the inevitable North Korean counterattack. Here and at numerous other key terrain features dotting the entire perimeter, UN forces captured high ground, leveraged UN air superiority and artillery fires to drive the North Koreans backward. As MacArthur had anticipated, the success of the Inchon landing and the 8th Army offensive caused the North Korean army to be cut off from its supply lines, and it was soon in headlong retreat. By the 23rd of September, the enemy cordon around the Pusan perimeter had been destroyed. The North Korean soldiers in the south had disintegrated as an effective military force.
That's quick.
While some escaped north, others fought as guerrillas in the south, but most were casualties. The breakout from the Pusan perimeter cost the 8th Army 790 killed, 3,544 wounded, but the 10th Corps and 8th Army soldiers combined had captured 23,000 enemy personnel and had killed thousands more.
Wow, that's impressive. So with them retreating and with Seoul already in UN hands, that's the anvil, you're saying, right?
Well, yeah,
And so where did they have to go? I mean, could they get through?
So the North Koreans now, all they can do is those that are on the north side of Seoul are able to extricate themselves and pull further back up into the 38th parallel and back into North Korea. And again, some units melt away, some go into the mountains and fight as guerrillas and do, cause some complications because the 8th Army will largely bypass those pockets of troops that take refuge in the mountains. And those folks fight on as guerrillas and will cause some headaches in the 8th Army's rear area as time goes on. But in large part, anybody that's not captured, killed, wounded is hightailing it as far north as they have to before they can reconsolidate. And they're going to try to defend North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, among other areas in the vicinity and just above the parallel.
Yeah, so by 1 October, UN forces start crossing the 38th parallel, right? So again, 38th parallel was basically the line between North and South Korea before the North Koreans invaded. So we are now crossing that line. But in the previous podcast, we talked about the UN resolution said everything south of the 38th parallel. So we're now crossing, going into North Korea. Was there any concern that we're legally, we don't have a mandate to do this?
Absolutely, there were concerns. As soon as UN leaders learn of the UN forces' resounding success with the Inchon landing and the breakout from the Pusan perimeter, and now coming up to the 38th parallel, they begin to debate the advisability of crossing the parallel into North Korea. The National Security Council advised President Truman against doing so. However, the Joint Chiefs of Staff disagreed, claiming military doctrine demanded that the North Korean People's Army be destroyed completely to prevent renewed aggression. President Truman eventually sided on 11 September with the Joint Chiefs and granted permission to proceed, while heeding the advice of the National Security Council to avoid provoking Communist China or the Soviet Union. He did this by putting limitations in place. The JCS directed General MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel for the purpose of destroying the North Korean People's Army, provided that no Chinese or Soviet forces had entered or threatened to enter North Korea. They further decreed that no UN forces were to go into China or the Soviet Union, and that only ROK Army soldiers should operate along those border areas.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
MacArthur received a secondary mission to unify all of Korea, if possible, under President Ri.
Oh, wow.
The responses to this decision were immediate and strong on the part of the Chinese. On 1 October, Communist China's Premier Zhou Enlai warned that China would not tolerate or stand idle if UN forces invaded North Korea. This was a clear threat that China would intervene if that should happen. The Truman administration and General MacArthur both eventually chose to ignore this warning.
Oh, wow.
The UN forces advance into North Korea after a week of fierce fighting through enemy-controlled choke points and high ridge lines. The North Korean capital of Pyongyang fell to UN forces on 15 October. On Korea's east coast, the 10th Corps elements came ashore. Again, more amphibious operations.
Now on the east coast, though.
The 10th Corps moves out of Inchon, moves around the peninsula to the east coast of North Korea. And so on Korea's east coast, the 10th Corps elements come ashore. The 1st Marine Division at Wonsan on 26 October, and then the 7th Infantry Division at Iwon, 80 miles north of Wonsan, on the 29th of October. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Walker took personal command of his advanced 8th Army headquarters in Pyongyang once they captured the city. And a month had now passed since the recapture of Seoul, and the 8th Army and the 10th Corps were now poised to make the final push toward the northern border area marked by the Yalu River.
You've talked about some of the limitations that they were given. How does MacArthur feel about that? And was he accepting it? Was he disregarding that? What was his goal, his objective?
He certainly understands the concern, but he's also looking at effectively how can he destroy the North Korean People's Army? Can he do that with ROK units in the lead? I mean, he's going to try to comply at least initially with the limitations he's given, but he's also been told to try to reunify all of Korea if possible. And
so kind of conflicting guidance there a little bit.
I mean, it is a cautious way to, and that's certainly what the JCS and the Truman administration are trying to do. But at the end of the day, MacArthur's credibility has soared in the wake of the success of Inchon, because the JCS had initially balked at his plan to land at Inchon. They thought there were too many risks, the tidal patterns, the timing, the potential of discovery, and yet MacArthur stuck to his guns, and to his credit, that operation succeeded in large part because of the combination of factors that we discussed. But and so in light of that, his credibility is huge at this point, and the JCS is more reluctant to question his judgment, whether they should have or not. At this point, maybe they should have, because we didn't have the great intelligence that we had going into Inchon. As we moved across the parallel, we're now moving into enemy territory, and we don't have the same warm fuzzy and the same great information that would facilitate our operations as we did before.
So we've captured Pyongyang and continue to move north, and then we get to the Yalu River. So a lot has been made about the Yalu River. Can you explain its significance and exact location?
Absolutely. So the Yalu River forms Korea's traditional border with China along Manchuria, the Manchurian part of China. And for a brief 15-mile section on the far eastern side, the last 15 miles before the east coastline, that borders the Soviet Union near the Tumen River. So that's obviously a risky area, right? When you're bumping up against communist China and the Soviet Union, you want to tread very carefully because you don't want to invite them into the mix if you can avoid it. So with Pyongyang secured, the 8th Army continues to push toward the Yalu River with ROK Army units in the lead. Korea's the Inchon River was the last major water barrier in the western part of Korea that is below the Yalu River, the actual border. So the Inchon River was the principal terrain feature in the 8th Army sector, and it dictated the Army's deployment and tactical maneuvers. 8th Army units pressed ever northward with ROK units and pursued North Korean Army elements as they approached the Yalu River, and some of those ROK units actually reported North Korean soldiers retreating across the Yalu into China over narrow floating footbridges. The The 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry, the old Task Force Smith there, was actually the northernmost advance of the 8th Army. They reached as far north as Chongodong, just southwest of the city of Sinwiju, which is right on the Yalu River, marking the northernmost advance of the 8th Army. By late October, in the mountainous region above Pyongyang, the 8th Army was poised to cross the Chongchon River in full force. On North Korea's east coast, across the formidable barrier of the Taebaek Mountains, 10th Corps forces had been landing on the east coast and were beginning their drive to the Yalu. Morale among the UN soldiers at this point is high, and for many they thought this would be the final push to end the war.
Right.
But then, of course, we know what happens as China begins to intervene.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. The Chinese now, they could talk a little bit about, when did they start coming across, and were they detected? There were the threats, but was our intelligence detecting the buildup? And if you can just address that.
At this point, without exception, General MacArthur, the CIA, and the political leadership in Washington, they all viewed the Chinese warning by Zhou Enlai essentially as a bluff.
Oh,
and President Truman had flown to Korea to meet MacArthur at Wake Island on the 15th of October to discuss strategy, to discuss the advisability of moving north and trying to avoid, and whether or not we thought the Chinese would intervene. At that meeting, MacArthur basically said that the best time for Chinese intervention had already passed by, and that they were no longer fearful of Chinese intervention, and that even if the Chinese did decide to intervene, that United Nations air power and artillery would be strong enough to thwart such an effort. That was his belief going in.
What about talk of atomic weapons at that point? Did that come up in Wake?
No, not at Wake. That kind of comes later on as MacArthur is bumping up against the limitations, in November as he's trying to push to the Yalu River, and Soviet MiG aircraft are coming in from Manchuria, the Manchurian side of the border, and interdicting his forces, and he's unable to respond or cross the Yalu, into Manchurian airspace or territory, and he takes umbrage to that because he feels like it's hamstringing him. Oh, yeah. Right? That leads to further controversy and eventual discussion of nuclear weapons and all that. But suffice it to say, between 14 October and the 1st of November, nearly 180,000 Chinese Communist forces secretly crossed the Yalu River into North Korea. General MacArthur is unaware of the full extent of Communist China's commitment, and he had believed that the initial attack that the Chinese make against the 8th Army on 25 October was more of a token gesture than a serious intervention, because the Chinese come in and they attack, especially the 8th Cavalry Regiment of 1st Cav, between 25 October and 1st November. This is the big, nighttime bugle assault, human wave attacks that surround and essentially annihilate the 8th Cavalry Regiment. But as fast as the Chinese made their attacks, they melt back into the hills and disappear. And it's like they're gone, almost without a trace. And so, MacArthur's not sure. He looks at that and he wonders, well, okay, they came in, they punched us in the nose, and then they're gone. Is this just something to see if we'll back off? Right. Is this really a major intervention, or is this a token Chinese unit? Right. And then there's rhetoric in political channels as the Chinese talk about Chinese people volunteer forces, right, that are helping the North Koreans. Okay. And so, the Chinese you got to give them credit. There's a lot of deception on their part, too, to try to minimize their footprint when, in fact, they've made a major troop commitment inside of North Korea. The Eighth Army falls back on the 6th of November to defensive positions along the Changchon, and the CCF units disappear as suddenly as they had appeared. By 6 November, all is quiet again in Korea. Now, the U.S. had been warned as early as 1 October by China, as we know, and with the U.S. seeking to isolate China diplomatically, there were few ways to really verify the veracity of their warnings. While aware of the dangers, U.S. diplomats and intelligence personnel, especially General MacArthur, tend to discount the risks. The best time for intervention had passed, so MacArthur thought. And again, they thought air power and firepower would cripple their ability to move and resupply their forces in any extended offensive. The opinion of many military observers, some of whom had helped train the Chinese to help fight the Japanese in World War II, was that their huge infantry forces that the Chinese could put in the field would be poorly equipped, poorly led, and abysmally supplied.
Oh, wow.
These experts failed to give full due to the revolutionary zeal and military experience of many of the Chinese soldiers, some of whom had fought in that Korean border area in those earlier conflicts with against the Japanese. Many of the soldiers were confident veterans of the successful Chinese Civil War against the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. Although these forces were indeed poorly supplied, they were highly motivated, battle-hardened, and led by officers, veterans, who in some cases had been through 20 years of nearly constant war. But great deference, as I said before, was paid to the opinions of General MacArthur, whose credibility was at new heights following Operation Chromite's success. MacArthur and his G2 Willoughby continued to insist that despite Chinese Communist attacks at Unsan and similar attacks against 10th Corps units in North Korea, that the Chinese would not intervene in force. On 6 November, the Far East Command estimated the Chinese total troop strength in theater to be only 34,500, whereas by the time of 6 November, the reality was over 300,000 Chinese communist soldiers organized into 30 divisions moving into North Korea.
And how many UN forces were there at the time?
Yeah, I mean, we at that point, we're maybe 200,000.
Oh, that many? Okay.
I mean, just but that's not all frontline troops,
exactly.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And so, you give credit to the Chinese Communist regime and its military forces. They knew how to play the volunteer reference in their political rhetoric. They moved troops into North Korea under cover of darkness, right, with the clever use of camouflage techniques by day. So even though we had nighttime photographic capabilities, right, photographic imagery, right, technology was very primitive in 1950. I mean, these were the days, Kodak flash bulb cameras, right? And so imagine that on a military scale where you have these flash bombs that you drop from aircraft to illuminate, to allow you to take a picture at night. But it's winter. The North Koreans are wearing white uniforms to blend in with the snow jacket. During the day, they're very clever in hiding both their troops and their vehicles. They hide them under haystacks. They hide them inside of cabins. They skirt the ridge lines, and they're able to avoid detection from photographic intelligence. They move under radio silence to escape comment detection. Any prisoners that are captured are taught to give false unit designations to throw off order of battle analysis, to say they're a part of this unit or that unit. It could be a unit that does or doesn't even exist. There's even some evidence to point to comment deception on the part of the Chinese by creating false radio traffic to throw off order of battle analysis.
Wow.
So the Chinese are a much more cunning adversary than their North Korean counterparts. And the reluctance by MacArthur to accept the Chinese presence, and then the lack of resolve of the political leadership to let any doubts they have try to put the brakes on MacArthur. They hesitate and they don't do it. They were fearful that if they did, they would deny the chance at victory. And so far, MacArthur had been able to deliver.
Yeah, and at this point, they think victory's at hand, right? So they had not just recaptured all of South Korea, but now most of North Korea. And as you talked about earlier, MacArthur's goal was to unite the peninsula, and they seemed like they were just about ready to do that.
Right on the cusp, at least so they thought.
Yeah. And then we get this one nosebleed attack by the Chinese, but we would have the massive Chinese intervention coming next.
In late November.
So we saw at the beginning of the war, the North Koreans come in the south, push us almost out of the peninsula with the attack on Pusan and the Inchon and the Pusan breakout. We push them all the way up to basically into China, and now we're about to see a new phase of the war. And we are going to cover that in our next podcast. So thank you again so much. The great insights here, and I'm really fascinated at the extent of not just the tactics, the strategy, but the intelligence aspects, how much those have come into play, the logistics, because we talked about with the Pusan breakout, the North Korean lines of communication were extremely long, but now we have the same thing for the UN lines now that we're all the way up in the northern edges of North Korea. So thanks for all of these insights. But before we end, do you have a Hua trivia to share with us about this?
Indeed, I do. So for General of the Army Douglas MacArthur was 70 years old when he became the commander of United Nations forces in the Korean War. When he retired from active duty, and that was the second time in 1951, he had done so originally in 1937. He was brought out of retirement for World War II. But when he retired for good in 1951 at the age of 71, his military career, inclusive of his 4 years at West Point, spanned 52 years.
Wow, 52 years. Oh, fascinating. And more trivia about MacArthur. He is, I think, only one. He and his dad are only one of two father-son Medal of Honor recipients in U.S. Army history.
That is correct. His father, Arthur, earns the Medal of Honor at Missionary Ridge during the Battle of Chattanooga and
Civil War.
In the Civil War.
Yeah.
And of course, his father goes on to become a 3-star general and lead the Philippine counterinsurgency campaign for several years there, and then eventually retires.
And then it was Teddy Roosevelt and his son, was it Teddy Jr.?
Teddy Roosevelt Jr., who lands at Utah Beach.
At Normandy. Wow, very, very cool. And then something you mentioned earlier, the Katusas, the Korean augmentees to the United States Army, started during the Korean War.
Indeed it does, and it endures to this day, right? This program where Korean nationals actually serve in U.S. military units. I remember having Katusas in my company in Korea.
Yeah, I served in Korea, and I went back there for several deployments, and every unit, I think it was from squad level up, had Katusas, and it did make a difference. It really helped us culturally with the language, but also training for them.
Absolutely,
and for us. So it was a great program started by necessity during the Korean War, but it continues to exist today. The Katusa program. So. Great. Some great insights here, great trivia. So thanks again, Dr. Knight, for your insights today about this second phase here in the Korean War. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Army in the Korean War or learn more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on our social media sites on Facebook, X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.